When the Port Elite locked an earthside logistician in the abandoned sector, alone against a giant predator, they were savoring a cruel lesson for yet another weak species. In response, Gray calmly shouldered 20 kilos of very hot soup and stepped into the absolute darkness of the frozen ventilation shafts. The human habit of treating lethal trials as ordinary courier routine always threw the arrogant outsiders off balance. But it was this awkward cargo, and the courier's manic stubbornness to protect those the locals considered garbage, that would make the dead mechanism shudder and rewrite the station's rules forever. Before the massive cargo terminal gates hung a thick ventilation hum, mixed with the smell of burnt insulation. The tall figures of the port officials, encased in ceremonial armor plates, towered over the only human in the dock. Their clawed fingers methodically entered long cancellation codes into the terminal, revoking the earthside logistician's digital passes one by one. Gray stood in silence. Instead of arguing, shouting, or citing signed trade contracts, he calmly shifted the wide canvas strap over his shoulder and checked the steel latches on the heavy thermal container with his fingers. The metal box swayed at hip level, giving off a dull, internal splash. Inside was exactly 12 liters of very hot soup. Your cargo at the main warehouse is fully impounded and direct dock access is closed, the senior official declared, his voice distorting through the built-in translator collar, turning into a harsh, metallic screech. The only bypass route runs through the abandoned sector of manual systems. Not a single rescue network works there. The old colony guardian hunts there. Only truly strong species may request the right to pass the right of the strong, to prove their worth to the port. For you, it is certain death. Gray adjusted the collar of his worn work jacket. To the port elite, their dry phrasing sounded like an ancient sentence and an official pretext for human surrender. To him, it looked like an ordinary courier shift with a very unpleasant altitude drop and atrocious lighting. The main merchandise was blocked, but this specific order had to be fulfilled at any cost. After all, food gets cold fast. He simply nodded, habitually shifting the bulky container's weight to his other leg, and patted the lid with a calloused palm. "Open the airlock," Gray replied curtly. The official let out an irritated hiss, clearly not expecting such indifference, but slammed a heavy palm onto the red sensor. The hard isolation protocol engaged. Dim emergency lights began to flash. The thick armored plates of the airlock crawled apart with a drawn-out groan, exposing the impenetrable darkness of the old, long unmaintained zone beneath an alien sky. A sharp atmospheric pressure drop immediately slammed into Gray, painfully plugging his ears. Cold, stale air and a distinct, acrid smell of ozone struck his face. That meant only one thing. The automatic patrol circuits were already active, and somewhere ahead, a massive predator had begun its hunting cycle. Gray took the first step over the threshold. His movements were deliberately slow and careful. Nearly 20 kilos of awkward cargo on his right shoulder physically prevented him from running, jumping, or changing trajectory abruptly. The slightest tilt of his torso threatened to break the lid's seal, and he had promised to deliver this soup intact and safe at any cost. He could not use a hovering glider or activate a kinetic shield, because any smart tech in this sector would draw the Guardian even faster than the fresh scent of blood. Instead of frantically drawing his plasma cutter or activating a tactical scanner, Gray pulled an old mechanical altimeter from a deep pocket on his thigh. Tapping the cloudy glass of the device with a dirty finger, he slowly crouched down and pressed his free palm firmly against the ribbed deck plating. The vibration beneath the cold metal unmistakably told him the rhythm of the worn-out water pumps. This was his personal, professional pride and his greatest weakness. He genuinely believed that deep knowledge of rotting pipes, drafts, and tangled cable routes was always more reliable than any strict safety regulations. Gray confidently chose the deepest and narrowest technical corridor, leading to the hidden lower levels. There was not even emergency lighting there, and the optical cameras from the control room had long lost their reach. The Predator, with its massive body, would find it incredibly difficult to turn around among the dense web of old steel rebar and thick hanging wires. Behind him, with a deafening metallic clang, the massive airlock doors sealed shut, completely cutting off the familiar noise and bright light of the secure residential sector. The pressure needle on the internal gauge dropped sharply. Gray was left in absolute, impenetrable darkness. He adjusted his grip on the ribbed handle of the thermal container, checking the weight distribution. Somewhere far ahead, an old water pump throbbed rhythmically and dully, setting a heavy tempo for the long walk. The human moved forward, guided solely by that monotonous mechanical sound. Meanwhile, in the warm and brightly lit terminal hall, the port officials stood frozen before the wide surveillance screens. They had expected to see a sharp spike of adrenaline, chaotic fluctuations of life support sensors, desperate attempts to break back through the blocked door into the port. Instead, the monitors displayed a steady, utterly boring cardiogram of the human and the green dot of the cargo, stably moving deeper into the abandoned sector. There was simply no panic. Gray was going to do his job. This quiet, stubborn fact completely shattered their habitual logic of fear. After descending 2 flights down a slippery, rusted staircase, Gray flicked the switch on his compact headlamp. The narrow, yellow beam cut through the dusty gloom of the corridor and immediately caught a piece of mangled inner paneling directly ahead. Across the sturdy metal stretched 3 fresh, frighteningly deep furrows from large claws. Thick technical oil dripped steadily onto the plastic floor from a ruptured pipe. The tracks led straight along his planned route, disappearing into the darkness toward the lurking predator. Gray sighed heavily, wiped a drop of cold condensation from his forehead, and stubbornly stepped onward. The sole of his heavy boot caught on a protruding edge of rebar as Gray tried to skirt the oil puddle along a narrow technical bridge. Trying to keep the 20-kilogram thermal container perfectly horizontal, he jerked his body sharply to the side. The ribbed rubber sole slid across the rusted grating with a deafening, screeching squeal. Gray froze, barely suppressing a curse, and carefully readjusted his grip on the cargo handle. The lid seals held. Not a single hot drop hit the floor, but that screech in the enclosed space rang out like a signal flare. The response was immediate. Somewhere ahead, beyond the solid old bulkheads, came a heavy, dull impact that shook the entire bridge. The air in the corridor instantly thickened, and the sharp, acrid smell of ozone intensified several times over. The mechanical altimeter on Gray's thigh clinked nervously as the internal pressure needle trembled from the powerful alien movement. The colony guardian had changed its route. From the sounds of a dull, rhythmic scraping of enormous claws against metal, it was clear the predator was cutting off the only path back, toward the sealed port airlock. The heavy bulk moved with terrifying speed, trapping the human in a narrow, dead-end span, where the bulky crate on his shoulder meant Gray couldn't even turn around properly to defend himself. Suddenly, the thick steel wall panel to Gray's right groaned and shifted a few centimeters, revealing a narrow, dark gap leading into a technical shaft. A thin, 3-fingered limb in a dirty work glove shot out of the darkness and waved frantically, pulling the human inside. There, crouched behind the panel, was the little repairer Tix. On his chest, a broken camouflage unit flickered dimly, the device that usually made his cast invisible to alien eyes and port scanners. To manually rip out the rusted emergency hatch lock and help the earthside logistician, Tix had been forced to completely disable his own camouflage circuit. That meant, right now, a crimson alert marker had lit up on the upper terminal control panels. A member of the lower caste had openly violated security protocol and interfered with the sacred right of the strong. "Faster, stupid species, faster," Tix hissed through a small portable speaker, his voice cracking into a whistling wheeze. "It's already on this level." Gray didn't waste time on questions. Sideways, carefully pressing the precious thermal container of soup against his ribs with his elbow and controlling every degree of tilt, he literally squeezed himself into the tight, cable-clogged opening. The moment his boots slipped off the bridge onto the dirty floor of the niche, Tix threw himself against the lever with a furious squeak. The heavy shield slammed back into place with a screech, and at the exact same instant, a terrible, deafening blow struck from the other side. The hatch metal bowed inward, leaving a deep dent, but it held. From beyond the partition came the heavy, furious snorting of a disappointed predator. A stifling silence settled in the cramped space of the cable shaft, broken only by the repairer's rapid, ragged breathing. Gray carefully lowered the thermal container onto a level surface, straightened up, and looked down at the trembling alien. In Tix's eyes, huge and moist, there was genuine, wild terror at what he had just done. Breaking port rules was punishable by immediate decommissioning and permanent exile, and his camouflage device was now officially locked out by the system. To the elite, this little mechanic was just a replaceable function, a part of the port machinery that had suffered a system error. But Gray saw a living being who had just risked his entire future to save a stranger from the Guardian's jaws. "Why did you come out?" Gray asked quietly, wiping sweat from his forehead with his jacket sleeve. "If you'd stayed quiet, the port authorities wouldn't have even noticed you." "You were carrying food for my work crews on the lower level," Tix said, convulsively clenching the torn wires of his camouflage unit in his fists, his gaze shifting to the intact, undamaged metal crate. "Everyone in port knows that Earthlings keep their word, even if they have to walk through hell. My people know how to value that. Now we're both violators, human. The system logged my ID, and there's no way back to the residential sector for me anymore." Gray silently patted the warm lid of the container, checking the temperature gauge. The soup was still hot, and that was what mattered most. The port's external scanners had already begun to whine dully somewhere in the ventilation, announcing a search for a new active threat in the abandoned sector. The Predator had blocked the outer hatch, cutting them off from the old route, which meant they would now have to get out of here together. Gray reached out and helped the little mechanic to his feet. The tight cable shaft smelled of old insulation and burnt dust. They had barely caught their breath when the rusty panel of the service terminal, set directly into the wall above Gray's head, gave a dry click. The dusty screen flickered with a pale green light, and the narrow space was instantly filled with the port leader's voice, distorted by the speakers. The official was broadcasting on the sector's open frequency, ensuring that every duty shift on the upper tiers could hear his words. The metallic screech of the translator collar dryly and imperiously demanded that the human immediately abandon his cargo and surrender the defective mechanic to the port authorities before the automatics cut off the oxygen supply. While the echo of the alien order still vibrated in the iron walls, Tix suddenly stretched up on his toes. His gaze was fixed not on the sound wave, but on the service symbols running along the very edge of the screen. The repairer's three-fingered hand trembled as he jabbed an oil-stained finger at the flickering corner of the monitor. The open machine codes of the current communication were streaming there in the background. "Look," Tix whispered hoarsely, tugging frantically at the sleeve of Gray's jacket. "The signal is routed directly through the primary isolation circuit. They were in such a hurry to seize control that they left a system hole right in the root access. If I short the panel contacts now and push this data packet through the general network, their entire elite superstructure will collapse." The repairer shifted his gaze rapidly from the human to the screen, his voice breaking into a whistle. "The docks will freeze solid. The safety protocols will fail. They will have to manually open the main terminal airlocks to reboot the core. We can simply walk out to the top, into the secure zone." Gray watched the scrolling green lines in silence. Then he shifted his gaze to the deep dent in the emergency hatch behind them. A collapse of the central network would indeed force the officials to throw open the doors to the port, but that same system failure would instantly disable the protective barriers between the abandoned lower mines and the residential levels. The massive colony Guardian, drawn by the sudden darkness and panic, would enter unimpeded into the crowd of unarmed port workers, traders, and the same kind of minor repairers, just like Tix. The Earthling let out a heavy breath. He carefully shifted the wide canvas strap of the thermal container, letting nearly 20 kilograms of weight hang exclusively from his left shoulder. Gray did not waste time on lengthy arguments. With his right hand, he roughly tore off the plastic cover beneath the monitor, grabbed a bundle of protruding power wires, and forcefully shorted them together. The terminal hiccuped briefly. The open sector channel instantly collapsed, replaced by the steady static hum of a direct encrypted line to the control room. "Port leader, this is the Logistician," Gray spoke calmly into the microphone, ignoring Tix's frightened squeak. "It appears you have a minor technical error in your base code here. You left an open access point to the core. I have switched our conversation to a closed mode, so that the junior personnel on the upper tiers do not accidentally see this vulnerability and start asking unnecessary questions about the reliability of your systems. Gray adjusted the soup container, checking its balance, and added in the same even, professional tone. You will not lose face before your subordinates, and the code error will remain strictly between us. In return, you will unlock the lower service passage for me right now. A heavy, dense silence hung on the other end of the line. The port leader, accustomed to hysterics, desperate blackmail, and pleas from trapped violators, was clearly trying to process what was happening. The human held in his hands the perfect opportunity to humiliate the elite and save himself at someone else's expense. Yet he had chosen to resolve the matter professionally. After 10 long seconds, somewhere deep beneath the metal floor, a deep, guttural clang of shifting armor plates resounded. The path downward was open. The alien leader had silently accepted this debt of honor. But the moment Gray released the bare wires, the terminal screen flared a harsh crimson light. The port's security automation, running on ancient algorithms and beyond the direct command of any official, had registered physical tampering from a compromised identifier. The little mechanic's status officially updated in the system. From a simple violator, he became an active threat to the station. The temperature inside the cable shaft began to plummet. From below, out of the passage that had just opened, came an icy draft that cut straight to the bone. A rising hum of heavy blades stirred deep within the pipes. The soulless machine had initiated a storm purge protocol. Gray raised the collar of his worn work jacket to shield his neck from the freezing wind, and gave the lid of his hot cargo a habitual pat with his calloused palm. "Going down," he commanded curtly, stepping into the darkness toward the ice-covered pipes. The descent began with the icy wind stealing his breath and searing his lungs with a sharp burn. The frozen pipes of the lower service passage slid treacherously under the soles of his heavy work boots. Gray pressed the thermal container tight against his left thigh, trying to keep his stride as level as possible to avoid slipping into the shaft's black void. Nearly 20 kilograms of awkward cargo pulled constantly downward, throwing off his balance. Every cautious step they took was now watched relentlessly by the red ocular lenses of automated cameras embedded in the rusted bulkheads. Far above them, in the warm hall of the secure residential sector, hundreds of workers, loaders, and minor repairers had completely halted their shifts. They stood in a dense, silent crowd before the wide broadcast monitors of the terminal. The soulless security system was streaming live footage, mercilessly tagging little ticks with a crimson outline marking him as an active threat, and the earthling walking beside him with a gray marker designating a condemned man. Suddenly, a thick steel ventilation grate above their heads groaned and buckled. The guardian of the old colony had not waited for the heavy blades of the storm purge to grind its massive body into pulp. Fleeing the deadly blades, the predator crashed down onto the narrow lower-tier technical bridge, landing with a deafening roar directly between the human and the repairer. The worn metal wailed pitifully under the weight of its claws. Ticks instantly curled into a tight ball by the railing. His instincts, and the entire harsh culture of the minor port, screamed only one thing: when a predator comes, the ballast is always thrown overboard. By the rules of survival, Gray was obligated to step back, preserve the precious food, and leave the defective mechanic to be torn apart. But Gray did not take a single step back. He quickly seized the wide canvas strap with both hands, planted his spiked sole dead against the ribbed grating, and sharply twisted his torso. The earthling hurled the thermal container forward with all his strength, swinging it like a massive, wrecking pendulum. 20 kilograms of red-hot metal slammed at full speed into the predator's heavily armored face. In the freezing air of the storm corridor, the steel box radiated such powerful, concentrated heat that the beast's sensitive thermal sensors were instantly blinded. The blunt impact drove the Guardian's bulk back a couple of steps. Gray immediately yanked the strap back, killing the inertia of the hot cargo, and stepped confidently into the gap, physically shielding the trembling repairer with his own back. On the other side of the screens, the crowd of outsiders let out a collective gasp. The terminal's thermal cameras clearly showed the bright orange spot of the container in the human's hands against the blue backdrop of ice. In their world, the right of the strong had always meant domination, confirmed solely by the death of the weaker species. The elite had survived for centuries by calmly sacrificing the lower castes. And now, on the monitors before them, stood an ordinary earthside courier who had used his strength and the weight of his cargo not to finish off the vulnerable, but to shield him. This simple human habit of standing up for those who had fallen was, before everyone's eyes, shattering the very foundation of the port hierarchy. Blinded by the soup's sudden heat and disoriented by the blunt physical blow, the predator let out a hoarse, vibrating roar. It retreated from the terrifying source of high temperature, its claws scrabbling helplessly against the frost, and swiftly disappeared into a dark side bay, away from the incomprehensible two-legged creature. As soon as the beast vanished, the station's automatics reacted to the critical temperature drop caused by the running fans. With a prolonged screech, the massive compartment bulkheads began to descend. The heavy blast doors sealed the sector shut on both sides, cutting the bridge off from external airflows. The hum of the blades died away. The air around them instantly became still and freezing. Gray exhaled heavily, a white cloud of vapor tearing from his lips. He carefully lowered the hotbox to the floor, checking the latches. The lid held, the soup inside only sloshing with a dull thud. The logistician reached out and yanked Tix to his feet. They were locked in a freezing corridor, facing a blank metal wall. To avoid turning to ice within 10 minutes, they would have to make the dead station work manually. The metal box Gray had so stubbornly dragged through the abandoned tiers held no culinary secret inside. Behind them, beyond the thick armor of the sealed door, the tracks of the frightened guardian were already cooling, while here, in the dead silence of the isolated compartment, the temperature was dropping with every second. The earthling knelt before the container and confidently clicked the steel latches open. The heavy, airtight lid slid aside, releasing a thick plume of aromatic steam. Right in the middle of 12 liters of bubbling, rich broth, securely fixed with heat-resistant clamps, rested a massive distribution coupler made of titanium alloy. It was the central key component for the colonial pump systems, one Gray had once promised to return to the repairer caste. The liquid food served as perfect camouflage. The dense, organic medium completely dampened the ancient metal's electromagnetic radiation, rendering it invisible to the port elite's scanners. Tix squeaked in admiration and pointed a dirty finger toward the blank wall, where the outlines of a distribution panel could be guessed beneath a layer of frost. The manual life support circuit pump had frozen here long before the ancestors of the current officials built the prosperous upper terminals. The mechanic quickly tapped his claws across the ice-covered metal, unerringly finding hidden grooves and rattling off short coordinates for the internal fasteners. Gray grabbed the edges of the frozen protective panel, threw his full weight against it, and tore it from its hinges with a crunch. The dark innards of the panel breathed out a smell of dry, stale burning and icy grit. The earthling took a firm grip on the heavy titanium coupler, mercilessly shaking the remnants of hot grease from it onto the frozen floor, and tried to wedge the part into the starting slot. The calculation of a quick, easy victory over the dead interlock collapsed in that very second. The ancient power cables inside the panel had soured and become coated with a dense crust of oxides, flatly refusing to seat into the distributor's slots. The mechanical drive was jammed solid. To close this circuit and send current bypassing the port's automatics, the bare, high-voltage wires had to be held in place manually, literally turning one's own body into a conductor until the system switched to autonomous mode. The slightest mistake, and we'll be burned to the bone, human, Tix whispered, his three-fingered palm trembling slightly on the distributor. Then hold on tighter, and don't even think about blinking, Gray replied curtly. He wound the coarse, finger-burning, ice-cold cable around his palm inside the worn work glove and pressed it firmly against the central terminal of the coupler. The air around them instantly crackled with wild, static tension. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end, and blue sparks flared in Gray's eyes as the residual charge from the ancient battery shot through his arm all the way to the shoulder. Muscles seized in a spasm. Tix, squeaking desperately with fear, threw his weight onto Gray's wrist from above, helping to hold the slipping wire and keep the arc from breaking into a short circuit. The ancient pump did not respond at once. First, deep beneath the deck plating, there came a heavy, strained groan, as if an enormous iron beast were stirring awake. Then the sound swelled into a dense, low-frequency rumble that sent coarse vibrations racing across the rusted walls. The mounting hum of working machinery grew so powerful that the ice crust on the bulkheads split into radial cracks and crumbled to the floor with a soft rustle. The autonomous manual life support system, awakened by their joint effort, roughly and irreversibly displaced the elite's digital protocols, seizing control of air distribution across the lower tiers. That tectonic roar of working machinery gave an immediate answer to the external pressure. The low-frequency wave, traveling through the metal as an electromagnetic pulse, drove the sensitive radars of the predator completely mad. From behind the blank wall, in a side bay, came the disappointed, pained howl of the colony guardian. The enormous beast, unable to endure the vibration and the dense heat now rapidly filling the corridor, finally retreated, withdrawing deep into the darkness of the abandoned sector. Through the narrow ventilation grills, the first stream of fresh, genuinely warm air rushed in with a hiss. On the main airlock panel leading to the residential tiers of the upper port, the emergency crimson lamps began going dark one by one. The heavy gate slabs, yielding to the pressure of the revived hydraulics, shuddered and slowly crawled apart. Gray leaned his back heavily against the warm casing of the activated pump, carefully lifting the empty but intact thermal container from the floor. Ahead, in the widening gate opening, the blinding light of the central terminal and the port elite already awaited them. The very elite who would now have to somehow explain the return of those they had officially written off for disposal. The blinding light of the central hall slashed at their eyes after the utter darkness of the lower tiers. The massive armored slabs of the airlock fully parted, and the sterile, dry air of the upper terminal struck their faces, mixed with the persistent smell of weapon grease and the ozone of filters. Gray stood on the threshold, pressing the empty thermal container, smeared with congealed grease, against his thigh. Tix huddled close beside him. Their path was blocked by a dense cordon of armed guards. At the front loomed the port leader in his heavy ceremonial armor. His clawed hand pointed directly at the human. The translator collar emitted a dry, metallic rasp, accusing the earthside logistician of deliberate smuggling of industrial equipment, sabotage of security logic, and direct abetting of a defective mechanic. Two guards stepped forward, preparing to isolate the trembling repairer. Gray did not step back or frantically reach for the plasma cutter on his belt. He calmly pulled his work tablet from the pocket of his worn jacket and turned the screen toward the port leader. On the murky display, a green line pulsed steadily. It was the very same encrypted communication channel, hanging on the open system vulnerability of the root code. The Earthlings silently reminded the elite of their recent bargain. If the official refused to acknowledge the debt of honor, Gray would simply sever the digital leash. The port leader froze, his claws nervously scratching the plates of his forearm armor. The machine's perfect logic collided with an inconvenient public risk. The official slowly raised his hand, halting the advancing guards. While the leader searched for a new, safer formulation of the sentence, movement began behind the backs of the convoy. From the side corridors, drawn by the tectonic rumble of the pumps coming to life, dozens of minor repairers emerged in silence. Tix's worker caste converged on the airlock in a dense gray crowd. The port leader, gauging the rising tension in the hall, spoke louder. He officially announced the cargo seizure, the full revocation of Gray's long-term license, and the termination of all premium contracts. At that moment, little Tix unexpectedly straightened up. He was shaking, but he detached the damaged camouflage unit from his chest, took a few quick steps to the nearest service panel, and forcefully jammed the wires straight into the main port of the central terminal. The portable equipment network responded to the intrusion instantly. On the displays of every mechanic's work tools, Tix's crimson identifier flashed up, flagged as an active threat to the first level. But instead of recoiling from the intruder, the crowd of outsiders did the exact opposite. The mechanics lowered their eyes to their scanners in unison, then looked up at the ventilation grills that had come alive, where real, warm air from the manual circuit now blew steadily and powerfully. One of the senior repairers in a grease-stained jumpsuit pointedly flicked the power switch on his console. The bright screen went dark. A second followed, then a third, a 10th. One by one, hundreds of repairers silently shut down their diagnostic equipment and stepped back from the service consoles of arriving ships. The entire complex logistics of the small port ground to a dead halt within a couple of minutes. The lower caste crowd shouted no slogans. They simply used an entirely new lever of economic pressure. The physical control of the station's climate was now exclusively in their calloused hands. A stark ultimatum was written in the absolute silence of the halted docks. Not a single trading vessel would be serviced. To restart the airlocks and prevent a collapse, the officials were forced to make concessions. The port leader, with an irritated hiss, entered a complex cancellation code into his wrist terminal. The threat status vanished. Little Tix officially received the mark of Master Keeper of the lower systems. The criminal charges against the human were immediately dropped to avert a further strike, but the authorities gleefully retaliated against his business. The port leader personally activated a holographic decree, permanently banning Gray from all commercial activity in the 3 central sectors of the station. The port was stripping him of his legal right to trade. Gray nodded calmly, shifting the wide canvas strap of the empty metal container over his shoulder. He had lost all his clearances and profitable routes, but this particular order he had delivered exactly to its destination. The Earthling turned and walked slowly through the parting crowd of guards toward the remote transit hangar. As his heavy boots tramped over the corrugated metal plates of the residential sector, a strange, monotonous sound rose behind him. The mechanics, lined up along the entire length of the long port corridor, raised their massive steel tools and struck the thick bulkheads in perfect sync. A deep, rolling thunder of dozens of wrenches escorted the human all the way to the landing pad. The station's hierarchy had broken, forced to yield to those who kept its mechanisms alive day after day. Gray adjusted the worn collar of his jacket out of habit, stepped heavily onto the ramp of his old ship, and punched the airlock seal button. His usual route was destroyed, but ahead there were always other roads, not yet traveled.